the number of grams of different nutrients that they should be eating based on what our ancestors ate, please understand that these numbers are completely fabricated. When you can get an easy source of high calorie food, you are going to take it. What we eat today looks nothing like what we could have evolved to eat. They were hunting and butchering and eating pygmy elephants and giant rats and things like that.
Should we try to eat an ancestral diet similar to our prehistoric ancestors? Is that a good way to decide what's healthiest for us? This is part 2 of my conversation with Dr. Peter Ungar, paleoanthropologist, evolutionary biologist, and distinguished professor of anthropology at the University of Arkansas. In part 1, we covered what is known about the diets of our prehistoric ancestors. And today we go beyond and we ask if we should be basing our food choices on what those ancestors might have eaten. We talk about which foods can and cannot be considered ancestral. We also talk about the health effect of those foods. There's an idea that if our ancestors ate something for millennia, then those foods should be natural for us and we should be adapted to them and they should be beneficial or at least safe for us across the board. So we talk about whether that makes sense evolutionarily. We also discuss whether a food can be the same food can be beneficial earlier in life and harmful later in life, an idea called antagonistic pleiotropy. We also talk about lifespan. Were our ancestors very short-lived, or is that a myth? And finally, we talk about brain development. What allowed our ancestors to grow big human brains? Was it meat? Was it starch? Was it fire? Or was it something else? A lot of fascinating and controversial topics. So let's get into it. So what modern foods, what foods available to us now even look like what our ancestors ate and could be called ancestral-ish? Because I think most species, both plants and animals, have been extensively bred and selected for, basically for commercial purposes, right? So is there any substantial overlap left?
As far as overlap between foods that would have been available, there is some, but not a great deal. And I mean, I think it depends upon which ancestors you're talking about, right? Clearly, our ancestors did not eat apples and bananas and pears and oranges. You don't get fruits like that in nature. These things, talk about the original GMO foods, right? These have been genetically modified for 10,000 years by our ancestors. And a colleague of mine, Richard Rangan, at Gombe actually tried to survive for a short time on chimpanzee fruits. He couldn't. I mean, if you see these fruits in the wild, they are tough. They don't have as many calories as our fruits by any stretch of the imagination. They're just like balls of fiber. They're very difficult to digest. We couldn't survive on them. We probably couldn't survive on most wild fruits, at least those that would have been available to our ancestors. So to go and have sort of cucumber and avocado salads with diced walnuts and turkey cold cuts in your Paleolithic diet recipe, that would not have been something that our ancestors would have had access to.
Yeah, and I think things like cereals, for example, have also been altered substantially to be larger and to be sweeter. And the animal species too, right? It's at least the main ones that we eat, the chickens, the cows, the pigs, have all been extensively bred basically for commercial convenience. So if someone wanted to eat like our ancestors, what would that look like? As far as animals, it would have to be something wild like an antelope or a wild deer, right?
I mean, clearly, grass-fed, grain-fed cows are going to have different properties than, say, deer that are in the woods behind your house, and that's sort of where I would go with that.
Yeah.
Chickens and turkeys that have been bred, I mean, those things are like flying breasts, So I mean, you don't necessarily see that. I'm not a nutritionist or a dietitian, and I can't speak with any authority about sort of the differences between wild and domesticated animals. But clearly, the foods that we eat here today have been bred basically to make them more palatable and higher calorie access and so forth.
Another question that's often asked is about the longevity of our ancestors, the life expectancy. Because one idea is that they were very short-lived, that they lived 30. I mean, if they got past childhood, that they maybe lived to 30 or 40 and they were old people by then. There are other views that know that some did reach older ages. Can we tell from the fossils, or is that up in the air?
Depends which ancestors you're talking about. If you go back to the Australopithecines, the Australopiths, or early Homo, most of the individuals that we have actually have their third molars just erupting, which would be prime age today. The equivalent of 21 as one of us. But that said, there's not a lot of evidence in the really early record of hominins surviving to the point where their teeth are gone. But later on, once we get into later species of Homo, we do occasionally see individuals with their teeth basically gone that would have required either tools or someone else to chew up their food for them. We even occasionally see individuals that have had their arm, for example, is atrophied, and they've had obviously some kind of traumatic experience that they've had to have been taken care of. So we do see, at least in later Homo species, Neanderthals, for example, we see some evidence that somebody must have taken care of these individuals. They weren't all sort of, by the time they got to be my age, they weren't all leopard bait. But earlier on, we don't see much evidence of that. And again, when you ask these questions about sort of what did our ancestors X, depends which ancestor.
Yeah. Let's say for the more recent lineages, the Homo erectus, Homo habilis, is it possible to quantify life expectancy or average age, or is that too granular to?
The evidence is too granular. We don't have, the fossil record gets better every year. There are lots of people going out and looking for these things, but we don't have cemeteries. We catch as catch can. We just have basically the number of Homo habilis jaws and teeth that we have can fit in two hands. There's really not that much. There's not enough to really know. And even if there were, how do you measure life expectancy?
Yeah, if you could estimate the age, you could maybe calculate some kind of average between the bones, or the skeletons. But it would always be very, very kind of vague.
And most of the individuals that we have, there are only a handful of skeletons for Homo erectus and Homo habilis, and there's just not enough.
Right.
Most of the fossils we have are teeth.
Right.
And those are notoriously bad for age estimates because some diets are more abrasive than others.
How informative are ancestor diets to infer what is healthiest for us? Clearly, what our ancestors ate allowed them to survive to reproductive age and pass on their genes. There's no, by definition, right?
We're here.
Right. But in terms of preventing disease that happens later in life, basically the diseases that we contend with in the Western world, heart disease, diabetes, cancer, neurodegenerative diseases, the foods our ancestors ate could have lowered risk of those diseases, could have increased, or it could have had no significant effect if there was no evolutionary pressure later in life at 60 or 70 years old, basically when those diseases usually manifest. So do we have evidence for one of these possibilities, or is it all an unknown?
I think the biggest value for modern health, when considering the Paleolithic diets, is the recognition that what we eat today looks nothing like what we could have evolved to eat, right? Yeah. Pizza and French fries and highly processed and refined foods are not things that our ancestors would have had available to them.
Yeah.
And so if you want to sort of be mindful of what you're eating, it doesn't hurt to remind yourself of that. Of course, it doesn't take a paleoanthropologist or a rocket scientist to tell you that, right? If you eat nothing but pizza and French fries and hot dogs all the time, it's not going to be great for you. And we know this. Does that mean that you should go out and sort of hunt for deer and eat nothing but deer meat and fibrous fruits? I wouldn't say that either, right? Like I said, we have evolved for a broad spectrum of foods. As far as understanding fundamentally whether the diets of our ancestors were somehow protective, I can tell you that we're pretty certain that our ancestors were not thinking about that when they selected what they were eating. What they were thinking about was, how many calories can I get and how can I get them in the easiest way possible? When you are faced, and thank goodness I've never been, and hopefully most of your listeners or viewers have never been, put in a situation of food insecurity to the point where you simply haven't had anything to put in your mouth. If you get to that point, like our ancestors must have been, like recent hunter-gatherers have been, you realize you take what you can get. And when you can get an easy source of high-calorie food, you are going to take it. Yeah. And that's probably why we have the problems we have now. As I've listened to some of your podcasts. I know that you've highlighted that as well. And so the reality of it is, our ancestors didn't think about or care about what the ramifications of what they were eating were going to be 10 years down the road. Yeah. All they wanted to do is get to the next day. Right. And I keep running through my head that TV show. I love it, Naked and Afraid. Right? That show, they're not beggars can't be choosers, right? They're eating whatever they can find in their environment. Although curiously enough, they tend not to eat termites, which you can see in the trees all over the place. Lots of people eat termites. They could survive perfectly well on termites, probably not even lose a lot of weight, but I guess it doesn't make as good television. In any event, people ate whatever they could get just so that they could get to their next meal. That's what was important. And yeah, if you start developing, if your arteries start getting filled with plaque when you're 60, that's probably not relevant to an ancestor. You probably had been lying bait long before then.
Antagonistic pleiotropy. Everybody wants me to ask about this. Is it possible or plausible that foods that are evolutionarily advantageous early in life can be harmful later in life? The same food could maybe increase the chances that someone gets past development and gets to reproductive age and reproduces successfully, and then raise risk of disease later on.
Absolutely. Makes perfect sense. Think about milk. Right? I mean, mammals didn't evolve to consume the lactal secretions of other mammals into adulthood, yet you can't survive without it as a small child. Mm-hmm. So yeah, absolutely. And going back to the same argument that I made before, if you're consuming high cholesterol foods as a kid, who cares, right? You're not thinking about the plaque that's building up in your arteries, and you'll probably be dead before that becomes an issue anyway.
Brain development. This is another big debate. What allowed our brains to enlarge and to become the big human brains? I know there's a number of theories. I've heard two main ones, but I'm sure there are more. The two main ones that I see are that it was the meat, and I think some people call it the expensive tissue hypothesis. And then the other one is that it was starch and the advent of cooking starch. Do you have a take on that? Do you think one is more likely than the other?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. And in fact, they're actually versions of the same thing, right? Leslie Aiello's expensive tissue hypothesis and Richard Wrangham's cooking hypothesis are really two versions of the same thing. They basically both depend on the notion that your brain is metabolically the most expensive tissue in your body. There are a few tissue types that are very expensive. The brain is one, your guts, your stomach, intestines, those are another. For those who have them, your testicles are also metabolically expensive. There's a few things. But the idea is that if you are going to consume a fixed number of calories, you've got to balance the number of calories that you're burning. And the way to do that is either to consume higher calorie foods and have expensive tissues, or consume lower calorie foods and have tissues that aren't as expensive, right? And so the basic idea is that there's this trade-off between the brains and the guts, right? So the brain gets larger, it's metabolically extremely expensive, and so your guts have to get smaller. But how can you do that? You need your guts. You need big guts if you eat tough, fibrous foods, right? You need to, therefore, if you grow your brain, you've got to put calories in it. You got to fuel your body with things that don't require big guts to process if you're going to get rid of your guts, right? What kinds of foods are those? Well, meat is one of them. So the basic idea would be that there's this sort of feedback loop between growing your brain larger, which makes you smarter and a better predator, and consuming meat, which requires much less gut material to process, because you're basically breaking yourself down, right? You're using meat to fuel meat. So that's sort of that hypothesis. The other hypothesis, which is the fire hypothesis, the cooking hypothesis, is that you can use fire to begin the digestive process. You cook food, it becomes easier to digest. You don't need a big old gut to digest food, right? And whether that's meat or whether that's plant material, that's sort of secondary to it. So the basic idea is you make it easier for your gut by either processing the food before it gets into the mouth or consuming foods that don't take a lot to digest. And then that allows you to grow your brain. Mm-hmm. Is it plausible? Sure. Is it overly simplistic? Probably.
And chronologically, do these things, the appearance of fire and the increase in intake of meat, do they help us distinguish what might have been permissive for brain development, or do they overlap?
The fire question is a really interesting one, especially in the recent weeks, when Lee Berger claimed to have discovered the earliest evidence of fire about 300,000 years ago, made by a human ancestor. We have, as you pointed out earlier, we've got fire about 800,000 years ago in Israel, nearly 800,000 years ago. Some have claimed that there's fire more than 1 million years ago in South Africa, like a site called Swartkrans. Others have argued that there's controlled fire even going further back than that in East Africa. It's hard to tell with this early evidence whether these are controlled fires or not, because the savanna burns naturally. So the actual start date is unclear. It is theoretically possible that the growth of brain size does somehow correspond to fire, but it's not at all cut and dry. That's not at all clear. As far as the consumption of meat goes, there are cut marks on bones that greatly precede the increase in brain size that come way before. The earliest cut marks on bone are at least 2.5 million years old. And at that point, we've got perhaps Homo habilis with a brain maybe getting up to 600 cubic centimeters, whereas ours is 1,400. So yeah, there's no real evidence of a dramatic increase in brain size. Even, 2 million years ago is about when we see large scale accumulations of stone tools and bones with cut marks on them. Even then, we're still in Homo habilis territory. So there's no real apparent clear association. I wish I could give you a clearer answer.
No. Exactly what I want to get is a representation of what the state of the field is and what paleoanthropologists believe currently. So, is it the case that is still undecided what this main factor could have been for brain growth? Is it still an ongoing debate?
It's an ongoing debate. The question is what selects for an increase in brain size, right? And socialization is usually invoked as the answer, right? The need to navigate complex social environments is the reason that we've got a larger brain. And even that is really difficult to figure out because even within species, brain size is incredibly variable. You've got Homo erectus in Georgia, if it is the same species as the Homo erectus we have in sub-Saharan Africa and in Eastern Asia, with brain capacities little above 700 cubic centimeters, but they're 1,000 in East Africa, around the same time. So that brings up the other question: what does brain size mean?
Yeah.
Right. There's no direct correlation between brain size and intelligence, whatever intelligence is. Neural net density is probably important, but we can't get at that with a fossil record. So it's not entirely clear. We do know that there are some very small brain hominins out there in South Africa, on the island of Flores, that probably used fire, certainly hunted with stone tools, were very intelligent creatures with fairly small brains. So you can certainly, that's another really good example. You've got Homo floresiensis on the island of Flores in the Indonesian archipelago with 400 cubic centimeter cranial capacity with tiny brains. And yet they were hunting and butchering and eating pygmy elephants and giant rats and things like that.
Yeah, even the whole idea of just the big brain versus the small brain is an oversimplification, and it's got to be much more nuanced than that.
Clearly, yeah.
Yeah. No, this is great because I think precisely the idea is that, the more distant we are from a field, the more oversimplified the notions tend to be. And so exactly what I want to, and a lot of the stuff that we convey to the viewers in terms of the nutrition and medicine and biology touches on this aspect of uncertainty and nuance. So, this dovetails right into our content that in a field where people haven't been as exposed to, there is substantial uncertainty and substantial complexity, and things aren't all clear cut and completely black and white. It makes total sense.
Yeah, in fact, if you read sort of one of the granddaddies of this whole movement, if you go back to the original Atkins diet books, he talks about our ancestors eating the fruits and berries of the forests and the animals that scampered around them. And I would just read this and think to myself, where is he getting this? Okay, this is intuitive and it makes sense, but there's absolutely no evidence to support this or any other diet. And I would say that when your viewers or listeners pick up a book that purports to suggest the number of calories of different types and the number of grams of different nutrients that they should be eating based on what our ancestors ate, please understand that these numbers are completely fabricated. There's absolutely no science behind them because we don't have evidence on this scale. yeah, I can tell you if our ancestor ate nuts or grass, but really, I mean, number of grams of saturated fat, not going to happen.
Yeah, the over claiming is a rampant problem in nutrition influencers, let's call them, and the abuse of paleoanthropology is a fashion. They all like to lean on what our ancestors may have done for different diets, all the way from the paleo diet to low carb to vegetable rich diets. They all kind of use this idea of, well, our ancestors did it, we have to do it. But yeah, the precisely what we try to do is juxtapose this type of simplistic marketing claims with the strongest evidence available, and we do that for nutrition all the time. But this is exactly along the same vein, is that a lot of these claims and a lot of these simplistic scenarios don't seem to be supported by the evidence in paleoanthropology.
Yeah, and in fact, you've made the case right here that the same evidence can be used to support a diet of tubers or a diet of meat or a diet of leafy vegetables or whatever you want to select. That just reinforces this whole idea that we evolved for versatility, and we can make our way in this world with such a broad spectrum of foods. And if you're going to celebrate the diets of our ancestors, just think about how important they were to making us who we are today. Think about how they allowed our ancestors to populate the entire planet when no other species of animal can find something to eat from pole to pole.
Yeah.
Only us. And I think that our diets have an important role to play in that and in making us human. And so, yeah, I think understanding diet and human evolution has value even far beyond applying it to what we should eat today.
So what's the take-home message from these two videos on paleoanthropology with Dr. Ungar? The record points to diversity in prehistoric diets. Basically, they ate what they could find. So versatility and an ability of humans to survive on a variety of diets. Also, there's substantial uncertainty and a lot of gaps in the fossil record and in the knowledge, especially with regards to details like proportion of different foods or nutrient composition. So good to bear that in mind and be wary of absolute claims. Also, most of the modern foods we have available were not available to our ancestors. That's true both of the plants and the animals. Most modern fruits, many of the vegetables, many of the cereals, and most of the animals that we consume were all extensively bred and selected for commercial purposes by us. And obviously the ultra-processed stuff like pizzas, soda, cookies, etc. And all forms of dairy would also not be considered ancestral, of course with the exception of mother's milk before weaning. So which foods might resemble what our ancestors ate? Basically foods found in nature, wild game, wild-caught fish, fruits or leaves or roots found in the wilderness maybe a wild mushroom, or at least the ones that are not poisonous, maybe a wild bird or its eggs. Honey, maybe, but I think the bees have also been bred for commercial purposes. The composition of the honey might have changed. And even for those natural foods that we haven't intentionally altered, it's good to remember those species, both the plants and the animals, have also been evolving for millennia. So there's no guarantee that those foods are just like what our ancestors ate, but they would probably be the closest if we had to guess. Does any of this even matter? Should we be trying to eat ancestral foods in the first place, whatever they are? The general idea is that if we've been eating something for millennia, then it should be natural for us and we should be adapted to it. And whatever harms that food might cause, evolution should have taken care of that and there should be no worries. And there's some truth to that. Obviously, whatever our ancestors ate clearly allowed them to survive and pass on their genes. But we don't know what effect those foods might have had on their risk of cardiovascular disease or cancer or Parkinson's or their longevity, their lifespan. We can't tell that from the fossil record. So it's possible those foods our ancestors ate lowered their risk of those chronic long-term diseases. It's possible they raised the risk, or it's possible they had no effect. In fact, it's entirely possible for the same food to be beneficial early in life and harmful in the long run. For example, it could be an important source of calories or of a specific nutrient that's hard to come by in the ancestral environment, so that it would help our prehistoric ancestors reach adulthood and pass on their genes, reproduce, which is really the evolutionary bottleneck, and yet not necessarily be great for longevity or for health in middle age and beyond. It's unclear how much selection pressure there was later in life in the ancestral environment in order to select for adaptations to avoid disease in that second half of life. So I don't think we can assume either way. As for that key factor for brain development, was it meat? Was it starch? Was it fire? There seem to be some proponents for each of these ideas, and it seems to be undecided. TBD. Also worth pointing out that whatever allowed our ancestors to evolve big brains isn't necessarily the best food for brain health throughout life in the modern environment, right? Same logic as before. A concentrated source of energy or nutrients like meat or starch could be crucial for brain growth early in life, and yet the same food could be suboptimal for brain function in the long run due to one or several of its components. There's no contradiction, right? So we have to be careful with the logical leaps, because a lot of times these ideas that sound very intuitive, well, if it was the food that allowed for big brains to evolve, it should be the best brain food. It's common sense. And yet it doesn't necessarily pan out when we really think about it. So the common question viewers ask, should we use prehistoric diets to guide our food choices in 2022? 2023 now. I think maybe as hypothesis generating, as ideas that we then test with actual observed health effects in living, breathing humans eating foods that we now have available, all recorded with statistical analysis so we can tell if there's any meaningful effects. The experimental evidence on nutrition matches ancestral diets on some things. For example, not eating junk food all day long seems to be a pretty good idea. On other things, they mismatch. For example, modern fruits, olive oil, yogurt. Those are just some examples of things that are not ancestral per se, but look pretty health promoting in general in the nutrition evidence. So this general idea that we should entirely base our food choices on fossils without any actual measurement of health outcomes, of prevalence of diseases, and what effect those foods might have on those, and that we should just assume that the foods our ancestors ate are optimal for long-term health across the board, I've never heard a compelling scientific argument for that. And that's one thing I was looking forward to double checking with a leading paleontology and anthropology and evolutionary biology expert, because if we could get that level of information and that level of confidence from fossils, then someone who has studied them his whole career would know that and be able to verbalize that for us. We can certainly bring on more specialists in this field if you guys want to see that. I'm fascinated with paleoanthropology. I loved researching these videos, so we can definitely keep digging, pun intended. We could bring on, for example, proponents of the different brain theories. That would be really interesting. So let me know your thoughts on all of that. Thanks for watching. I'll catch you next week.